So, first of all, before I begin my lecture, I would like to thank Professor Yuval Shani from the Cybersecurity Research Center, as well as Dr. Tamar Bernblum and Michael Cohen, who assisted in the conference. I would also like to thank Yoram Cohen, the CEO of ISOC-IL, as well as Meital Greiver-Schwartz and Abigail Sagi, also from ISOC-IL. And also, I would like to thank, last but not least, for Eli Reches from the Crown Family Center for Jewish and Israel Studies at Northwestern, who assisted me also in organizing this conference. And so let's begin. So there's something really stressful about being a keynote speaker in a conference, right? I feel like I'm a bit outside of my comfort zone. And so when I was trying to figure out exactly what to say and how to present, I of course approached Google, right? We all do that, who was kind enough to offer me several dozens of websites filled with wonderful suggestions, advice, tips about how to be a keynote speaker. So apparently I have to be engaging, funny, compelling, humble, and knowledgeable, all at the same time. Unfortunately, I'm not exactly sure how to do that, right? Okay, so unfortunately, I don't have the ability to entertain people while talking about digital rights. I leave it for John Oliver to do so, right? Yeah. And I cannot show you pictures from demonstrations about digital rights because I've never participated in one, right? This is one demonstration from Hungary 4 years ago against internet tax. Unfortunately, I'm a researcher. And so as a researcher, what I can do is just to raise questions, to bring out questions for us to think about, questions which will hopefully trigger discussion, deliberations, interesting talks, right? And so hopefully that I will be able to do. And so let's start with some of the questions that I have in mind, right? So 3 questions to think about, not just during this session, but throughout the entire day and even afterwards. First of all, what are digital rights? What exactly are we talking about when we are talking about digital rights? Second, who can be defined as digital rights advocates or activists, right? How do we define these people, these institutions, these entities? And finally, what is digital rights activism? What's so special about it? How do we define it as well? And so let's begin with the first question, right? What are digital rights? So, first of all, digital rights is often like a fancy name for just saying human rights in the digital age. But if we want to look a closer look and a more elaborated look on that, we have to see that the whole discourse of digital rights is actually the result of 3 different, distinct professional discourses evolving throughout the years, right? So first, we have the UN Declaration of Human Rights back in 1948. Right? This is the first discourse. The second is the discourse of communication rights, which evolved separately. One of the important milestones were the Hutchins Commissions in 1947 discussing the role of the media, especially after the Second World War. And the second one is the McBride Report, issued in the 80s following the initiative of UNESCO to understand the role of the media in the world. And finally, the third discourse which evolved, the first discourse which evolved is the discourse of digital rights management. Now, just to be precise, when we are talking about digital rights management, we mostly talk about issues of copyrights and fair use. But it is interesting that because of this discourse, people began to address and to relate to the possible influence of technology on human rights, on our lives. And so while digital rights management is different from digital rights, we could see this kind of influence between both of these discourses. And so all of these three discourses came together, resulted in the discourse of digital rights as we know it today. And now this discourse of digital rights began, if we want to place it in the context of history, somewhere around the late 80s. But it received a huge boost in the beginning of the 2000s. The beginning of the 2000s, the WASIS process. For those of you who are not familiar with the WASIS process, this is the UN World Summit on Information Society. a conference which was organized by the UN in two separate phases, in 2003 and 2005, to discuss the issue of information society, to understand the role and the influence of internet on our lives today. And so at the conclusion of the process, at the conclusion of the summit in 2005, in a document known as the Tunis Agenda, it was emphasized over and over again in the documents the importance of the internet, the contribution of the internet to the issue of human rights, and the possible influence. And while it is mentioned over and over again in the Tunis Agenda that digital rights are important, that human rights are important, it was never really specified in the agenda what exactly are we talking about when we are talking about digital rights. And so from 2005 till these days, right, we have seen different charters, we have seen different declarations, we have seen different petitions, we have seen different documents, each one trying to make sense of this digital rights idea. What exactly are we talking about? And so, for example, we had the Internet Rights Charter from 2006. And we had the Global Network Initiative Principles from 2008. And the Council of Europe Internet Governance Principles from 2011. And then again, the Declaration of Internet Freedom from 2012. And this is just a partial list. There are so many other documents and charters created by civil society organizations, by internet companies, by governments, describing the meaning of digital rights. The most, I would say, interesting, elaborating, the most comprehensive document that exists today dealing with digital rights is the Internet Rights and Principles Charter, right, from 2014. And so the interesting thing about this charter that it was created by the Dynamic Coalition for Internet Rights and Principle, a coalition that works within the Internet Governance Forum, a forum which was created by the UN in intention to continue these discussions and debates about internet policy. The forum was created following the WASIS process, right? And as part of this forum, different coalitions were created, one of which dealt with the internet rights and principles. And let me just show you the idea behind the Internet Rights and Principles Charter. So the coalition outlined 10 principles for us to think about when we are thinking about digital rights, right? So let's take a look at them. The first one, universality and equality. So this is just the basic premise, right? That humans are equal and free and should be respected as such. Next, rights and social justice, right? Internet is a place for protecting human rights and advancing social justice. So here we can also see the agenda behind the internet. Next, accessibility. Everyone has an equal right to access and use a secure and open internet. Expression and association. Everyone has the right, of course, to seek information without censorship and to publish information freely. Next, privacy and data protection, right? Everyone has the right to privacy online. Life, liberty, and security pretty much, stands for itself. We all have the right to live a secure life. Diversity. Again, we see here aspects of agenda here. Cultural and linguistic diversity should be encouraged online. Network equality. The network should be built in a way that everyone should have universal and open access to the internet. Open standards and regulation, but it should be open standards and regulation, because in this specific item, they are referring to the fact that the internet's architecture should be open, but at the same time regulated. And finally, governance. Human rights and social justice must form the legal and normative foundation upon which the internet is governed. And so I remember seeing the charter for the first time, thinking about what does it mean? What can we say about these principles? What can we say about the boundaries that these principles create? Are these even realistic boundaries to begin with? Aren't there any problems, inherent problems within this declaration when we are talking about the various rights? I will just give you one possible contradiction, right? And there are several of them, right? Privacy and security, something that we will discuss hopefully in this second session today. And what about the contradiction between open internet and regulation? Well, I'm not saying it should be contradictory notions, but we can see the possibility of contradiction here, right? And what about other rights? Rights such as the right to reliable information. This is something we didn't think about. They didn't think about when they created the charter, and it relates very much to the role of social media companies today. Is it even a right to begin with? And this is something that hopefully we will address in the first session today. And finally, the right to preserve our image, something that Yoram has already outlined and something which will be dealt with today as well. Is it also a right to begin with? Is it something for us to consider? Is it something for us to include in this charter, in the 10 Principles Charter? And as I told you, the point of this session, the point of my lecture today is to raise questions. So these are the first questions that I bring up in front of you to think about, to engage with. Right. So this is the first set of questions. The second one, who can be defined as digital rights advocates? When we are talking about activists, when we are talking about advocates, who exactly are we talking about? So again, going to the traditional definitions, going to the traditional ideas, we are talking about entities, right? And I specifically say entities in the broadest possible sense, that deal with digital rights violations as imposed by governments and internet corporations. We often see how these entities operate in two tracks. The first one, we're talking about the constitutional, the judicial, the political arenas in which these entities, these organizations, these individuals try to combat internet organizations and governments. But at the same time, we can also see them working within the mediated public sphere, right? Trying to reach out to the people, trying to reach out to the public, whether it is to influence the public opinion, whether it is to convince people in the importance of their work, whether it is to educate people about these issues. And so under this definition and under this umbrella, we can find many international and national organizations, right? We have, for example, organizations such as the Privacy International, an Association for Progressive Communication, and Access Now, and Article 19. And we are very fortunate to have with us today Ms. Paula Martinez from Article 19 from South America, right? And these are organizations that operate in the international level, right? They operate in different countries. But at the same time, we also have national organizations that operate in different countries independently. We have, for example, the EFF in the US, which is considered to be one of the most important and influential organizations. We have Derechos Digitales in Chile. We have Bytes for All in Pakistan. We have Digital Courage in Germany. We have Fundación Vía Libre in Argentina. And we also have Open Rights Group, the organization from the UK. And again, we are very fortunate to have here with us today Mike Morell, one of the activists from this organization. And all of these organizations work together, as I mentioned earlier, advocating for digital rights in the different tracks. But again, I would like to, once again, broaden the boundaries. Think about other organizations. Think about other entities, right? For example, we have ISOC, and Yoram mentioned it earlier. And while ISOC, Internet Society, operates in different countries around the world, in each country we have different kind of ISOC. In Israel, the Israeli chapter also deals with issues that relate to digital rights. It's true, dealing with other issues as well, but digital rights as well. And for example, the latest project about digital memories is a great example of how to tackle issues of digital rights from a broad perspective. We have another type of organization such as the CCC, the Chaos Computer Club. And this time we are talking about one of the leading organizations of hackers around the world. This organization, which is situated in Germany, has over 7,000 1,000 registered members of hackers trying to work with technology, focusing on technology in order to advocate for digital rights. And they are relying in the work on hackers' ethics. They are very different from the organizations I mentioned earlier. Next, we have other organizations such as Legacy Vault and Save Beyond, which will be mentioned here today as organizations that deal with the post-mortem legacy. Again, different perspective of digital rights and different notion of advocacy. We have Ranking Digital Rights, the Rebecca McKinnon Project, right, which is a different kind of civil society organization that tries to define and set global standards for how companies in the ICT sector should respect freedom of speech and privacy. And the work that they're doing is wonderful and interesting. And finally, we also have civil society organizations that in their own way actually advocate for some form of censorship, either for the well-being of children, either in order to fight issues such as children pornography. And here we have the Internet Watch Foundation from the UK, or we also have the International Association of Internet Hotlines. And these civil society organizations are also part of the advocacy efforts, but their focus is different and their point of view is different. It's a point of view which can be said and which can be said is a more advocates for more of a censorship, I would say, or for more content regulation online. So we are talking about different entities and we're talking about different organizations when we are talking about digital rights. And so I would like to suggest a different definition perhaps when we are talking about activists or when we are talking about advocates. I would suggest that when we are talking about digital rights activists, we are talking about entities that aim to change the mediated informational and cultural environment in which we are living, in the broadest sense of the word. And by this they are basically trying to challenge the status quo as determined by governments and by internet companies. This is a different perspective when we are talking about digital rights advocates, something for us to think about and to debate about. And finally, right, the last set of questions concerning the idea of what is really digital rights activism. When we talk about activism today, what exactly do we talk about? And so we all have, when we are talking about activists, we all have in mind these like demonstrations of people walking around with posters and slogans, right? Similar to the pictures that I've showed you from Hungary 4 years ago. And these are pictures from 6 years ago from public demonstrations in the matter of ACTA back in 2012, right? But is this the only form of activism? Let's look at other examples as well, right? Yeah. So activism can be manifest also in global online campaigns. They do not necessarily have to take place outside, right, in the real world, in the real public sphere. They can take place in our online public sphere. And this is a great example, right? This is an example from the SOPA PIPA actions, activities and demonstrations back in 2012. And for 24 hours, people had to live without Wikipedia in order to understand the implications of SOPA PIPA, right? And this is one example. Another example is, of course, activism through filing lawsuits, which again kind of fits our description and our premises when we talk about activists, right? So this is, an example from the Chilean organizations, the Retos Digitales, who filed lawsuits against the violations of privacy by drones in Chile, right? This is one example, another example of activism. And so, what about social media activity? What about sharing and liking posts on Facebook? Can we consider it as a form of activism? So this is an interesting question because today when you're asking people, especially people from the academia, they usually tend to dismiss this kind of activism. They usually tend to define it as slacktivism or as clicktivism, right? It's not real activism. But here, I would like to highlight something. Let's think about the political and geographical context of social media activity. It is true that when we are talking, for example, about the US, right, or any other Western countries, if you're just sitting at home clicking likes and sharing posts of some digital rights organization, it might be to some extent be considered as selectivism. But what happens when we are talking about people who are doing it in other countries, such as Pakistan, such as Russia, right? So this is an example of the Russian digital rights organization known as Roskomsvoboda. Please forgive my language, I do not speak Russian, right? And this organization advocates for digital rights, advocates against the government, advocates against some of Putin actions when it comes to issues of internet freedom. And so when such an organization publishes a post on their Facebook page encouraging people to install VPN, explaining them the importance of VPN, and people actually click, people who are Russian citizens who live in Russia, actually click like and share to this post, can we still consider it to be selectivism, knowing the possible risk that they're taking by doing so, right? This is something for us to think about.
It's also the call for action at what you ask people.
Exactly, which actually leads into the next aspect of it, right? So again, what are we doing when we are talking, for example, a different kind of activism, private, educational activity? This is an example from the Brazilian organization Act Antes, who on their website publish and inform people about encryption and about how to install encryption and about how to use encryption as part of their day-to-day lives. Another example is example from Germany, from Digital Courage, right? These are flyers, and it's more than just flyers, right? The picture here is just of the flyers, which includes instructions for self-help, digital self-defense. These are two examples from a broad variety of so many tutorials and webinars and information which is published on the organization's websites, aiming to help the citizens to understand more about technology, aiming to help citizens to install different kind of technology in their houses, in their own personal laptops, in order to defend themselves, in order to protect themselves. And these activities are taking place in private houses, in the private sphere. There is a good chance that no one will ever know about the actual influence of these resources, right? And it's a good chance that nobody will ever know how many people actually use these kind of resources in order to defend themselves. But isn't this just as activism? Thank you. But isn't it just as activism as demonstrations, as filing complaints, as filing lawsuits? It's a different kind of activism, but nevertheless still activism. And finally, what about private local meetings? So this is an example from the French organization. I will not say the name in French because believe me, this will be even worse than when I try to say something in Russian. I will just translate that the name of the organization is the Keepers of the Net, the Guardians of the Net, right? Probably parallel to the Guardians of the Galaxy, right? And currently what they're doing, they're holding local private meetings in Marseille with the local people in Marseille to deal with the implications of surveillance system installed there by the municipality, by the city hall, right? And these are small meetings, private meetings. Nobody knows about these meetings. They're not even published on the website, right? Because we are talking here about a different kind of activism. So we see activism, at least from the perspective and based on these different actions and based on the perspective of these organizations, does not have to be a public thing. It can be a private thing, right? It does not have to be something which involves demonstrations. It can also be something which involves education. And finally, it is not something which is supposed to sweep an entire nation or the entire world. It can just be about the small things, about the everyday practices which are relevant to local communities, to local groups. And so I would ask, what else, right? What other possibilities, what other options do we have when we talk about activism? And this is my question for the session today concerning this topic. What else?
Yeah. I'd like to ask a question regarding the tour project. Tor project basically is a digital rights activism as well. I mean, it's based on volunteers around the world, which allow networks not to be surveillanced.
Mm-hmm.
So, in other words, it would be just as easy as an example here, because most of the world is understanding that browsers need to be completely off the chart. You know?
I mean, I wouldn't say that most of the world. I would say that very specific groups and individuals think like this. I think we have a long way to go until we reach this point in time in which you can say all the world. But I agree with you that from a broader perspective, yes, this is a great example of another form of activism, with this time one that focuses mostly on technology. And so I would just like to wrap up and, to let the day actually begin. 3 questions for us to think about. What are digital rights? Who can be defined as digital rights advocates, and what is digital rights activism? And in the spirit of the conference and in the spirit of this my speech here today, we have 3 excellent sessions today about digital rights, and I would very much like the audience to be active as well, right? Activism is not just something that we talk about, this is something that we actually do. Participate, ask questions, offer us solutions, offer us new ideas, help us not just to define the boundaries of these rights, but also to define them as well. And as I'm sure many of you are, I'm also looking forward for the discussions and the deliberations today. And all is left for me to say now is just to, wish you a pleasant day. And thank you so much for listening to me. Yeah.
Good morning,
Yes.
everyone. Good morning, everyone. I'm Yuval Shani from the center here, from the Law program. I apologize for not being here for the opening part. I had some old school car problems.
Sometimes technology can
Yes, but that's how it is.
Yeah.
So I want to just briefly welcome you all on behalf of the center. I don't know if Tamar, if you said some introductory words, but we're very pleased to host this conference. We're a center that focuses on the interplay between cyberspace, cybersecurity on the one hand, law and criminology on the other hand. We are located in the law school, but we have researchers such as Efrat coming from other disciplines as well, and our home base is in the computer science schools. So we are actually trying to be as interdisciplinary as we can. We are looking at 3 main themes in our work. One is the issue of regulation, and I'm going to ask you a question in that regard immediately. And then there are other questions which are perhaps one question more interesting for lawyers, which is the question of liability. Who has to incur legal responsibility when things go wrong, mostly with regard to breaches. And then we also have issues of enforcement. And of course, cyber digital activism is relevant to all 3. But at this point in time, perhaps more to the regulatory framework, which is, and that's, I think, that's a big difference between digital activism and more traditional human rights activism, in the sense that when one is dealing, and that's my hypothesis.
Yeah,
it would be interesting to hear. Would be interested to hear your reaction. But with regard to the traditional human rights activism, we already have the structures in place. We have a state. We have a regulatory ecosystem, and now within this system, we are working on many reforms. But by and large, it's taking an existing product model and adjusting it to a certain idea, the Declaration of Human Rights, what have you. Here, I think part of the challenge is that the model is still being shaped. And the question, to what extent do you see digital rights activism as being engaged in devising the architecture of this world? So that's a big question. But the question is, and that brings me to the question of what are the boundaries of who is an activist? In the ordinary human rights discourse, we have a parallel conversation about human rights defenders.
Right.
Who is a human rights defender? And that has certain, at least as a lawyer, this has certain legal ramifications, because if you are a human rights defender, then you are entitled to certain international protections. Okay, the question is, what is the parallel here? Why should we, let's put it provocatively,
Okay.
why should we care whether a group or a person or a clicker is or is not a digital right activist? So from a research point of view, I can see the interest.
Mm-hmm.
But do you see a practical dimension? Can a company be a digital right activist? I mean, we are engaged here with a conversation with some of the big players, and at least on some issues, they take they embrace, be it for strategic reasons or be it for or be it for other reasons. They endorse a lot of these issues. So, for instance, you would find fewer. You would find strong advocates of free speech online with some of the major internet companies. I mean, who are very concerned about censorship. So the question is, should we be seeing them as part of the digital rights activism? And finally, well, I'll stop here. Maybe I have to. There's a long day.
So you brought up so many ideas, and to be honest, I don't think I have the answers for all of them. But let me just say with the last one that you mentioned about the companies. So this is something that I've been struggling with myself, right? We have this notion of activists as, freedom fighters. We're thinking about the underdogs in many ways. And all of a sudden, we have today companies saying, from various reasons, such as you just mentioned, that hey, we want to take part in this campaign. We share your perspective, and we want to contribute to the well-being and to the preservation of digital rights. Unfortunately, and this is just my personal instinct, I have this tendency to be a little bit more careful when we are dealing with these companies, whether they have other interests. And we've seen, I think, some examples about companies that on the one hand promote ideas that resonate with the ideas that I mentioned here, but at the same time they have their own interests. And we had the Facebook initiative in India to provide people with India free internet, but then again we are talking about a limited internet, right? And we had...
through Facebook, I should say.
Yes, through Facebook.
The internet equals Facebook.
Exactly,
So
and you don't have...
I am against this initiative. I was really happy that Amos failed.
So this is one example.
It's
Yeah.
awful.
Yeah. You go on.
No, I don't want to comment about that. I have something else to comment.
So take the mic.
Take a mic.
We're not a lot of people here.
Yes. The comment that I have about your talk is that somehow I miss the role of the technologist in both in the historic perspective and also in the actual influence today. Because if you look at the history, you gave a list of events.
Yeah.
Like the Declaration of Human Rights and this and that and that. These are lawyers' issues. And I would say that, for instance, the Diffie and Hellman, who invented basically the concept of PKI, and then RSA, has much more influence about digital rights than lawyers that are defining all kind of things. And I also want to say about some of our activity, like for instance, Doron is sitting here. We are operating an exchange which is called the IIX. Okay, so it's a technological solution that currently which originally was in order to give better service to the internet user in Israel, but has effect on equality and on competition and all kind of such aspects. And this is kind of a purely technology issue. And I think that in the discussion, it should not be a discussion only for policymakers and lawyers, because in our times the technologies are very important, and basically they are setting the rules. So you see it both on the challenges that comes from, like, if Google in the beginning says we do not do evil, they understand.
They erased
Yeah, they erased this sentence a few months ago, but they understood that they are going to, the outcome of their technology is that there may be evil involved in that, and they were technologists. Okay, so I think that in this discussion, this is an important question.
I agree with you completely. I did mention the discourse surrounding digital rights management as the influence of technology, but you are quite right when you're saying that we need to put a greater emphasis on technology when we are talking about these issues of digital rights. I agree with you completely. But you know, this is the thing about Google, and this goes back to the point that you were making earlier.
Maybe you can bring them up.
Oh. And so this goes back to the point made earlier, right? When we are talking today about companies, about internet companies, about private companies, and about their interests, can we rely on them, right? Can we trust them? And so I would say that when we're, for example, talking about Google and Facebook, there are still so many issues concerning their, I would say, true intentions, right? But on the other hand, we do have other companies that they actually see the importance of these issues, and they try to cooperate and you know, and go along with the trend of digital rights. I think that Microsoft is one of them. I'm not sure about it, to be honest, but as far as I know. But this is, again, a great topic to think about and to discuss. Yes, Paula.
Just in relation to the engineering and the technical aspects, I cannot go much further on that, but I just wanted to mention that Article 19 has been working with the Internet Engineering Task Force, trying to bring the discussion about human rights standards into that specific forum. And it's quite interesting, and it has been reverberating a little. So I think it's an interesting approach, and I think that's also an important part of digital activism that we should take into consideration.
Paula, can you explain a little bit about Article 19?
Oh, yes, sure. Article 19 was mentioned over there. Is one of the organizations. Actually, it's a human rights organization that focuses on freedom of expression and information. But we have been dealing a lot more recently with digital rights, and I'm in the next panel, and I can explain a little bit our approach to that. But I come from Brazil, and I just wanted to mention our relationship with some of the companies over there. I don't know if you heard of Marco Civil da Internet. The legal rights framework of the Internet is a piece of legislation that is very progressive. It was passed in Brazil a couple of years ago, and we had the companies as strong allies at that moment, and we were able to work very well with them. All of them had people that were doing lobby directly, and they are they have very sophisticated departments to engage with government relations. So these people were engaged in the discussions surrounding Marco Civil, and they were allies. But right now we are discussing the data protection bill, and the situation is a bit different. So I just wanted to show, like, when we were talking about these general principles, and it was a broader type of legislation, it was quite a cooperative situation, and not that much right now. So.